which is obviously very timely. And it's also very foundational to really everything that RUBI does, because we are operating in places that are anywhere from 50 to 80% Republican. We know that if we go into these places with the kind of hyper-partisan vitriol that's become the norm, that would really just be political quicksand for us. So we try to weave depolarizing strategies into everything we do, including our Community Works program and all of our communications and campaign strategies. And so what we thought we would do today is take a step back and get into what is polarization, what kinds of problems does it create, and what can we do to diffuse it. We have with us today two very skilled practitioners from the world of depolarization. Zachary Elwood is a former content strategist for the Builders Movement, which is an organization that's committed to overcoming toxic polarization. And Zach is also the author of the book Defusing American Anger and the host of the People Who Read People podcast. We are also grateful to have with us Kristin Hansen. Kristin is the co-founder and executive director of the Civic Health Project, an organization that uses technology to foster healthy discourse and social cohesion. And I'm going to turn it over to Zach and Kristin in just a moment. But first, I wanted to share a statement put out by Martin Luther King III about the Charlie Kirk assassination. I'm going to read some excerpts, and then I will post a link to the full statement if you want to check that out. Whether we agree or disagree with the words a man speaks, we must never lose sight of his humanity. Never forget the sacred dignity that lives within each and every person. We are living in an hour of great moral crisis. Our public square is ablaze, not only with words of disagreement, but with the fires of hatred, suspicion, and revenge. The fabric of our beloved community is being torn apart by bitterness and the refusal to see our political opponents as our brothers and sisters. Today, we are being called to a higher way, a way that sees beyond left and right, beyond red and blue, beyond slogans and shouting. We are being called back to the table of brotherhood, to the hard but holy work of reconciliation. So I don't know about you all, I really love that. And I think it really sets the tone for what we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to turn it over now to Zachary, and then we hope to have Kristin with us. She is having her power went out like 10 minutes ago, and she is trying to find a way to get online with her phone. So we hope she will be able to join us. And if not, we are in terrific hands with Zachary Elwood. So Zach, go ahead. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Erica. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, so I just want to start by saying, in addition to the Diffusing American Anger book you mentioned, this book I wrote, How Contempt Destroys Democracy, was specifically for a liberal anti-Trump audience. So it's probably more applicable to this audience. So I wanted to mention that. And I want to start with saying, talking about these things is not easy. I think if, part of the reason toxic conflict in general is so hard to overcome is because it is so difficult to talk about. If it was easier to talk about, we'd more often overcome it and be less often to amplify it. But I think it's just fundamentally difficult to talk about for many reasons. So I want to emphasize that because I think sometimes people hear, something from me or someone in the space that triggers them and uses that as a reason to kind of write off these ideas. But I think that happens a good amount on both sides. So I just want to emphasize that these things are worth looking into. So I focus in my work on getting politically passionate people to see that they can embrace depolarization ideas and depolarization work while still working toward what they believe in. I think often we believe that embracing these ideas about reducing conflict are something that, hurts our political goals or efforts. But I actually think, it's quite clear that you can do both. And also think it's quite clear that trying to keep these ideas in mind, make your own political activism and work more effective, because you're more often persuading people and less often creating pushback. So I wanted to emphasize that maybe for the RUBI, the goals. So talking about taking a wider step back and saying what even is polarization, what is toxic polarization, when we talk about that, what do people in this space mean? And it's not, the problem isn't about disagreement. It's not even about strong or even angry disagreement. That those things are common and normal and often necessary. Societies always have things that many people disagree about. The problem becomes when there's so much contempt and excessive fear, worst case visions of the other side. Polarization expert James Cohen has written about this recently, and he thinks a better name for polarization, toxic polarization, is overthreat, where people are just excessively scared and pessimistic about the other side, whether the entire, quote, other side or most people on that other side. So I think most people's reaction to that on both sides when they hear that is something like, no, but they really are doing very bad things. And to be clear about that, it's not wrong to think your opponents are doing bad things. I don't even think it's necessarily bad to hate specific people on the, quote, other side. But I think the problem comes in when so many people in a society have so many broad, all-encompassing, contemptuous, and highly pessimistic views about so many of their political opponents. And that leads to people speaking in very contemptuous and insulting ways and acting in those ways and ramping up the toxicity of the conflict. And, I think, and both sides, people on both sides will, be more in tune with how that plays out on the other side, right? And less in tune with how it plays out on their side. But I think, for example, Erica's book, Beyond Contempt, is a good book that I've referenced a lot for people to see how the contemptuous aspect and the conflict amplifying aspect can play out on the left. So I think it's important to see that even if you think one side is worse, it's important to see that there are these self-reinforcing aspects of the conflict that continually ramp it up. So there's this cycle that goes on. Both sides start acting in ways that convince their opponents that, yes, they do hate them and want to destroy them. And there's a good amount of research on that. There's research showing that there's excessive, inflated views of how much the other side hates, people, hates our group. And in a country of 340 million people, you can always find a lot of bad examples, rude and horrible examples, various bad events, things to build your narrative. And let me know if I'm getting too close to my time, being short, Eric. If I didn't keep a close look on the time. But the recent murder of Charlie Kirk, as you probably see, many conservatives are speaking as if that's some sort of proof that the, quote, left is violent and dangerous. But we also see this on the left as well, when there were several far-right mass shootings in a short period of time several years ago. Many liberals were doing similar kind of scorekeeping about the right and how those incidents showed the right's uniquely violent and dangerous nature. Now, again, we're not getting into whose side is more right about such things. We're talking about perceptions and how we build our narratives. So, and you've also got conservatives scorekeeping about the, cruel and insensitive and horrible things that people have said about Charlie Kirk's murder as a way to say the other side is, that this proves the other side is bad. And I've done my own scorekeeping for that. I'm very much anti-Trump. When before, like in 2019, when I took a much less healthier approach to these things, I would go into pro-Trump Facebook groups and gather all these deranged and bloodthirsty, nutty things people would say in these Facebook groups that were very scary to me and helped me think, the other side is completely deranged. So this is just to say it's very easy for us to do this kind of scorekeeping and tallying of offenses and use that to show, to build our narratives about who's worse and why they're worse. But but yeah, in my work, including in a liberal, I don't know if you know the outlet, the Liberal Patriot, but I had a piece for them a few days ago trying to examine this kind of scorekeeping tendency and why it's childish, why it's unhelpful. I guess I shouldn't say childish. It's a very understandable thing to do when we're in conflict. But I would argue that it's very unhelpful, and it leaves out the complexity of the conflict, and for example, one thing I try to emphasize when it comes to polarization is we often in conflict we tend to see, we have an instinct to see that conflict is very simple, like they're bad and we're good. But there is this complexity to any human conflict where the groups are very different, and how their anger, how their rage, and their frustrations will play out in each group are quite different, which leads to various differences that both sides will use to score points on the other side. So for an example of what I mean by that, you can imagine that the rage of how say a blue collar working class group has a lot of rage, the way they manifest their rage will be very different than the rage of a group that's, predominantly highly educated or more higher socioeconomic status or whatever. So for example, this lets us see that there's various group differences that govern how these things play out, and both groups will focus on different parts of the conflict. So conservatives will focus on what they see, these big swings in liberal side views over the last few years, and say that shows that, they're bad. Liberals will focus on Trump's contemptuous personality, and say there's nothing equivalent on the Democrat side. So this is a short summary, but just to say that group conflict is always complex, and it's very easy for both sides to take the evidence around them to form pretty persuasive narratives about why the quote other side is bad. And I think that's an important idea about conflict. So I do also think that, as much as violence is obviously bad, and clearly us being highly polarized leads to more political violence, I also think it's true that polarization puts us in a very volatile state where we're overreactive to individual acts of violence, right? We read into individual acts of violence, which are statistically quite rare in a nation of 340 million people. So, and you have to remember, even in a highly unified, non-polarized society, you'll have some violent and deranged individuals. And then there's also the fact that, many of these acts are much more about mental health issues than any real political coherency or ideology. But I think polarization makes us as a society more fragile and more volatile. We're like a train going too fast on the tracks, where like even small incidents can derail us, which I think, why it's so important to try to reduce the toxicity and the emotional, overstatement of things. And again, this isn't to downplay the seriousness of the violence and the upsetting nature of the violence, clearly, because these things too, the reason I work on it is because polarization does make these bad things more common. But we have to keep in mind too that we do, as a society, highly exaggerate even just the number of how many Americans actually support political violence. Some surveys that have been shared widely have said that this is between like 20 and 40% of Americans, but much better research shows that it's under 3%, and probably that's on the high end. These are just rough estimates. But Sean Westwood, the polarization researcher, has talked about this large overstatement based on bad surveys and bad interpretation of surveys, and there can be a self-fulfilling prophecy aspect to that overstatement. How much time do you think I have there, Erica?
A couple more minutes would be fine.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks.
Seems like I'm on track there. Okay. So yeah, where does all this leave us? I think what I focus on in my work is focusing on the only thing you and I or anyone can control is what we ourselves do. I think it's important to see that there's nobody coming to save us and fix our toxicity, and that's why I work on this work. I think we all need to start seeing our role and how we treat other people, and share these kinds of points with other people, seeing our role as much more powerful than I think many of us see our role as, because I think we all influence other people around us much more than we know. So I think to be granular about it, It means avoiding broad and contemptuous speech about the other side. It means checking ourselves before we share what might be distorted news or memes. It means asking, what am I really accomplishing with my political focused energy? Am I persuading people, or am I just venting and amplifying divides? I think for liberal and anti-Trump people, I think it means seeing Trump's divisive and contemptuous behavior as an outcome of polarization and less of a cause, because toxic conflict does result in more support for us versus them and polarized and no compromise approaches. So if we want to reduce support for those approaches, I think all of us have to strive to speak in ways that minimize insult and division. And I think that's possible to do even as we work towards our goals. I think it actually helps make our speech more persuasive. And I'll give you a concrete example. After Charlie Kirk's murder, I think some politically liberal people can feel a pressure to say basically, yes, we denounce the violence. Violence is bad, but also let me explain to you why I think Kirk was a bad person. Now, I think we can easily understand why that's angering to people if you flip it around and imagined a prominent Democrat person assassinated, and Republicans say, yes, violence is bad, but let me tell you why this person was horrible and dangerous. Just so it's what Philip Tedlock called the turnabout test, which is just imagining in any scenario, flipping the scenario to be politically opposite. And it's useful. That's a useful exercise for gauging how our words strike other people and helping us speak more persuasively for our own goals. And yeah, finally, I know I'm running up on time here, but I think I think we can do all of these things while criticizing our opponents, while working towards our goals. There's even research showing that Dan F. Stone, the author of Undue Hate, the book Undue Hate, which I think is one of the best books on American polarization, he had a recent study showing that dehumanizing political rhetoric actually lost votes. And I think a lot of people have an instinct that the opposite is true, that we need to be tough and aggressive and call out more people. But I think that's the wrong instinct. I think some people would look at Trump and be like, oh, it works for him, right? We need to emulate him. But I would say, I don't think it has worked for him. I think he's driven a lot of people away. We just happen to be in a very polarized situation where, aggressive techniques do work, but they work in a polarized scenario where, there's a lot of polarization. So I think we need to kind of turn the tables on that and see the benefits of taking in these depolarization ideas while we work for our goals.
Thank you so much, Zach. And I would love to get hold of that study.
Yeah,
That
that's a
sounds really
recent.
important.
Yeah, he shared that with me the other day. I was like, I'll try to get that out because I was. Then there's a few things like that. I should try to compile them and make a post about them. Yeah.
For sure. Thank you. Um, okay, it looks like Kristin Hansen was successful in getting on here. Thank you for persevering, Kristin. And I introduced you earlier. I don't know if you were on
Yeah,
to hear it or not. So you can go ahead now. Thank you for being here.
I did see and hear that. Thank you. I'd like to do a quick sound check with you first. Is
So far,
everything
so
okay?
good. Yes.
Okay, good news. I hope to score some points with the audience. When my power went down, I jumped in my car and drove downtown to an area that I think has good cell coverage. And if that ceases to be the case, I hope you'll let me know. I don't want this to be uncomfortable for your audience to listen to. So, really sorry about the hiccup. But I'm here in my car and really delighted to be with all of you and with Erica and with Zach. Zach and I have actually had well, it's been delightful for me anyway, working alongside Zach and being inspired by his voice every day in the field while doing the work that we do. I saw a question from Mary Claire, by the way, that just popped into the chat. Should we take a moment to step back and talk a little bit about the organizations that we're both a part of?
Feel free.
Zach, do you want to hop back on first?
Yes. Sorry. Yeah. Did you want me to share what information?
Just like your quick bio and maybe a little bit about your work with builders and so on. Besides
Oh,
being an author, we all had the chance to see your book, but what's
right.
your
I
affiliation with the space and the work?
Well, I worked with this group, Builders, aka Builders Movement, a nonprofit started by Daniel Lubetsky. I don't work with them anymore, but I helped write content and do content strategy for them. And yeah, and then I have my books and I have my Substack and talk to people in the space occasionally about ideas. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Zach's voice has really just rung out like a clarion call throughout the field in terms of understanding some of these social science drivers of how and why we all behave the way we do, and and some of the challenges that we are all equipped to overcome if we simply have a better understanding of the wiring that's inside of us, the impulses that drive us all, whether as adults or children, to be combative in the ways that we interact with each other, to feel a heightened sense of threat or fear, to seek forms and methods of division between us. So I know we wanted to start the conversation today with Zach providing some of that context, but we also wanted to then turn the page and talk a little bit about solutions and inspiration and sources of hope for all of us in the work. And I'm noticing the questions coming in too. I'm going to try to weave responses to at least a couple of these into my comments, and I'll try to get my comments out quickly just in case my connection proves too disruptive. So I really do want to bring to all of you today a message of hope in the midst of a really difficult time in the country. We've already touched on the Charlie Kirk shooting and its aftermath, the tone and tenor of some of the discussion around that, and how we as a country can just keep scraping ourselves off the floor when it seems that we're entering into these periods of conflict and disruption in such a repeated cycle, a rinse and repeat cycle, if you will, right? It's so predictable, really, when any kind of an instance or tragedy occurs that it's almost immediately politicized, weaponized, and moved into competing echo chambers of interpretation. And Jim, I want to acknowledge your specific question about how do you contend with almost a drowning out of divisive content or approaches, the surround sound. How can we overcome that? You know, sometimes on my team, and I should probably mention my organization too, Civic Health Project, we talk about the toxic sludge, this just constant onslaught of toxic sludge. What do we do about it? Let me address that, and then I'll come back and introduce myself and my work. But the real message I want to suggest to all of you is there are a couple of things we can do. First of all, we can ourselves switch off and reduce the amount of intake, the content that primes and triggers us to feel a sense of fear, a sense of threat, or a perception of our neighbors and our fellow Americans as the other. Now, you might say, well, I might be doing that. I might be able to do that. But what if my neighbor doesn't and continues to engage and indulge in that type of toxic content that might cause them to feel a sense of opposition towards me? Well, we can only control what we control and embrace and model the behavior that we can. So admittedly, that sense of agency extends only so far. But the other thing we can do is we can refuse to amplify. We can turn down the amount of that content that's being propagated out. Whether we are promoting content because we like what it's saying or we're promoting it because we don't like what it's saying, either way, we are contributing in small ways to the toxic flow, the toxic sludge coming through. So those are just a couple of small ways in which we can contribute to lowering the heat, lowering the temperature, and refusing to give a platform to the kind of toxic, divisive content that we know is not good for any of us. Let me take a step back. I'll introduce myself as Kristin Hansen. I'm the executive director of Civic Health Project. That's at civichealthproject.org. We're a national nonprofit and nonpartisan organization whose North Star is seeking scalable solutions to America's dangerous divisions. And a couple of things that I want to highlight there are the words scalable and solutions. And in fact, these are the solutions that my team and I have been seeking and supporting and upholding for years now. And I wanted to get straight to the point that if you aren't already aware, around many of you, most of you, perhaps even all of you, are resources in many of your backyards that you can tap and draw upon to support your own journey to contend with division, overcome division and model the kinds of behaviors and practices that Zach was earlier describing. And I'm just going to frame this up quickly, and we'll move to Q&A as soon as possible for you to get some questions out to Zach and me both. But what I want to suggest to you is that depolarizing ourselves, our communities, and our country is a journey. It's a journey for every one of us. And this journey has three dimensions. I call them sometimes the three I's, which I describe as individual, interpersonal, and institutional. So what do I mean by that? Individual journey. Individually deciding to work on polarization is something that we can all do without needing to even engage in one uncomfortable conversation with anybody else. And it involves the kinds of actions that we've already hinted at, like picking up a book, like Zach's book, for example, or the other one that was recommended in the chat, or a third one that is really popular and one of my favorites called What's Our Problem? And Zach, I know you like that one too. What's Our Problem by Tim Urban, a really excellent reflective book about what it is in all of our wiring that makes us feel these divisive impulses toward one another. A second resource that I'd like to suggest to you all, if you are eager to embark on an individual depolarizing journey, is just check out the website conversation.us. That's conversation.us. And it is a curated set of resources that any individual American can pick up, generally for free or very low cost, to go on your own self-paced and guided journey in understanding how to become a less polarizing actor in American civic life. So I really encourage you to check out that site. Now, that site will also lead you to opportunities to practice, embrace, and model interactive or interpersonal behavior that depolarizes as well. And once you've spent some time reflecting on this journey, you'll be ready. You'll be ready to put these skills into practice, to apply curiosity, listening actively, assigning goodwill and good faith toward others. I would say among those characteristics, curiosity really leads the pack. Opening your mind and your heart to wanting to engage in deeper exploratory conversation with folks around you to understand what makes them tick. What makes them tick? I mean, we all, as human beings, though we might be wired to be divisive, are also wired to be connected, to be groupish, to lean on our neighbors, and seeking out those opportunities to sit down with somebody where it might feel a little uncomfortable. You might be inclined to think that they see the world differently than you do. You don't have to lean directly into politics. You don't have to ask them questions that lead right to the heart of where you disagree, but rather just curious, intentional, deep questions that indicate that you're interested in learning who they are, why they see the world the way they do, and how they came to see it that way. And one of my favorite books for this, to help guide you into those sorts of conversations if they're feeling uncomfortable these days, is Monica Guzman's book called I Never Thought of It That Way. I Never Thought of It That Way by Monica Guzman. She really spends a lot of time on the art of interacting with those who see the world differently. Finally, institutional. So this is the third part of the journey, and all of these can overlap with one another. But each of you in your communities, you're leaders, and you show up in places where your neighbors are showing up too. It might be a school, it might be a church or a place of worship. It might be a community center. It might be a sports team or a homeowners association or a workplace. But as you embrace the individual and the interpersonal components of this journey, you're ready to take the further step of thinking about how to create bridging spaces out of the spaces that we inhabit in our daily lives, the places where you and all your fellow Americans, neighbors, members of your community go to work, play, pray, lead, learn, study, serve. How do we turn spaces into bridging spaces? How do we create the kind of culture, the kind of DNA that broadly endorses and supports those values and practices that I was outlining a few moments earlier? Active listening, curiosity, perspective sharing, assigning goodwill, empathy. These are all things that we can put into practice in our hearts in our conversations, and in the institutions where we show up. So again, I just want to kind of leave you with that: individual, interpersonal, and institutional elements of the journey towards a bridging way. With that, I think I want to be sure to turn it back to Erica and to open things up for questions. I see a lot coming into the chat, and I thank the person, whoever it is, that is transcribing some of these suggestions into the chat. Actually, just before opening the floor, let me share a couple of other resources that might be inspirational, particularly for those of you living in rural areas. I want to offer four websites, organizations, and associated websites. So whoever's transcribing, please keep up. Let me get these out quickly and into the chat so you can do your own exploring. I want to encourage you to check out bettertogetheramerica.org, doing fantastic work to connect local civic leaders, particularly in rural areas, who are trying to stand up efforts to engage in community problem solving across lines of difference. That's bettertogetheramerica.org. A second is called Trust for Civic Life. Trust for Civic Life is working with some of the most creative and innovative instances of civic renewal and civic bridging across the country. For all I know, some of you on this call might be in a Trust for Civic Life community. That's at trustforciviclife.org, where you can find a second set of examples and models that might be very inspiring. The third is an organization called Urban Rural Action, a team that I work with closely, and they've instigated projects in different parts of the country, from Pennsylvania to Maryland to Wisconsin to Oregon, to connect rural and urban communities into a single room, a single table to work on problems together. And last but not least, an organization called More Perfect Union, which, and it's located at mpu.us, mpu.us, launching service chapters in communities, particularly rural communities all over the country, to engage in bridging, service, and civic engagement across lines of difference. So I wanted to just put all of these out as inspirational models that might spark some of you to think about, well, what kind of model could work here? If we don't already have a civic hub or a place of civic renewal, a place of bridging that exists in our community, what might it take to stand one up? These, to me, are some of the most inspirational examples out there, and I'm sure you all have some of your own as well. Maybe we'll get to learn about them in the Q&A. So with that, Erica, I turn it to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Kristin. Those all sound like very worthwhile groups. And I mentioned at the outset of the briefing our own initiative, the Community Works program, that
Yes.
I think most people on this call might be familiar with, but I'm going to ask Meredith to come on for a second in case there's folks who don't know about it yet. It is very much in line with the other groups that you were mentioning. So Meredith, tell us about Community Works.
Thank you, Erica. Yeah, we are very excited. We're holding our very first nationwide Community Works Summit this coming October 22nd, 6:30 to 8 p.m. on Zoom. We'll get that in the chat, the information about that. But this is RUBI's on the ground effort to work side by side with our rural neighbors in our rural communities, and I live in one, and sort of bridge the divide by doing concrete work around local needs. And we don't spend, or we certainly don't put the emphasis on talking through political things, including Charlie Kirk, but I have an example about that I could share. But much more on just finding that common ground, working together through doing that, rebuilding trust with our neighbors, and then going from there in terms of what that might mean in terms of deeper engagement and conversation with each other.
Thanks, Meredith, and stay on for a second, because I think why don't we go ahead and kick off the Q&A with that story that you mentioned to me earlier that I think is really interesting. And then I see Phil Gerson's hand up, and other folks can go ahead and start raising your little Zoom hand or putting your questions in the chat.
Sure. I live on a long country road, and I have a neighbor probably about 1.5 miles down. And on reflection of this, I realized that I actually did sort of some community works type engagement with her probably 2 or 3 years ago, because I run a nonprofit that works on wellness for kids, and we give out fruits and veggies, and we're always trying to get them donated. And so she had a pear tree in her backyard and said she could donate some pears. And I remember going over there. But on this road, it's not like we talk to each other. You know, we're really spread out, where everybody's far off the road. And I remember going and talking with her, and she told me then that she was very concerned about her, I think it was her granddaughter, being bullied into that, you know, it was weird from my point of view, right? I mean, it was being bullied into being trans by the alternative community in our Floyd County schools, which is where my son grew up. And that I was just, you know, the exact opposite, right? Exact opposite of my experience. And I remember just kind of saying that at the time, but leaving it there. So anyway, after Charlie Kirk, she had started her daughter had started a hair salon down there at their, they have a single wide down there. It's called Beards and Broads. And so we go by and we see the sign. And then after Charlie Kirk, she put something on Facebook, which then, of course, one of our LGBTQ people, you know, on the opposite side amplified. But it was basically saying, I'm just going to read a second of it to you. I never thought I'd ever need to say this, agree to disagree, but I don't feel safe around anyone radical. I used to be Democrat. I left the party because of terrorist ideals and flat out lies. I'm sorry for any hurt feelings. I'm all for love, but my husband, children, and I respectfully ask you not to come onto our property. It's my private property. All nonviolent, God-loving Americans, you're safe and welcome here. But if you're offended by this, then evaluate your life choices. So it created this huge, you know, furor within the Floyd community, which is a very small community. But we've got 7,000 people on our one big Facebook group. So as you can imagine, this was just this really horrible, negative back and forth. And I guess the one thing I could say out of y'all's solutions is I didn't amplify it, you know, either side, because I agree. I mean, that's really what was stoking the fire. But on the other hand, we drive by her hair salon every day out our road. And now she's got a big Trump flag out there. And I guess it's just the example of, okay, what's happened in our communities, and love your thoughts about other steps to take.
Yeah, Zach or Kristin, any thoughts about very concrete ideas for how to diffuse a situation like that in a local community?
Zach,
Yeah,
you want to start?
sure. Yeah, I think I mean, yeah, none of these things are easy because, you know, the nature of these things is that many people are highly emotional and upset about all sorts of things, right? So it's never going to be easy. But I think I mean, one thing you can do is try to I think that what they call the turnabout test of thinking about reverse situations, and you know, if you were talking to someone like that, talking about similar things that you were upset about, or at least people on your side, on political allies of yours who also get very upset about equivalent things, because I think sometimes people are more apt to see how they're being unreasonable if they see examples of their opponents acting in ways that they think are unreasonable, and you know, if you can find examples like that, that's just a granular thing. But I think your point about not amplifying, you know, thinking carefully about what am I trying to accomplish with this, you know, so often I think the social media conversations are completely unproductive and just end up, you know, because we're not really having conversations on social media. We're just making statements, and usually we're making kind of rude statements. We're often making rude statements, or they're interpreted in worst case ways. So I see very little good outcomes happening on social media. So I tend to think about, yeah, how do we discuss it in person? And yeah, but hopefully I think there's much more to say about how to have the in-person talks about specific angering emotional topics, but I think, being aware of what their trigger points are and why they're upset, and showing that we have empathy for that, while maybe, saying like, oh, are you overreacting, and, giving some, some points about that, but in sympathetic ways. But yeah, there's a lot more to say about that, but I think that's what came to the top of my head.
How do we want to proceed? Should we just kind of look at questions in the chat or call on people?
Sorry, I didn't realize I had muted myself. I had just said,
Yeah,
Kristin, did
no.
you have anything you wanted to add to
Oh,
that,
yeah,
or?
that's fine. I think that's a great response, and we can keep moving through questions that folks have. I know I saw a couple in the chat, but it's great if you could just kind of facilitate the
Yes,
question. Like,
absolutely.
yeah.
Okay, I'm going to go to some of the raised hands, and then I'm going to ask Anthony to help me sort through what's in the chat. Phil, you can go ahead.
Sure. You mentioned Monica Guzman. I've been a member of Braver Angels
Great.
for 3 years. And there's two, I want to mention one thing. One thing I'm advising our Washington State Braver Angels group is to get together, the people, the conservatives and the progressives in the group, and dialogue about all these issues that are streaming down one after the other, so that when we facilitate, we can get our minds around where we want to take the dialogue. But what I wanted to say is that uh, with the Charlie Kirk, I didn't until he got killed, I didn't know much about him, but I did some research. And here's what I concluded, and here. So I listened to Charlie Kirk, and he's a very smart man. He knew how to debate, and so forth, and um, and that's fine. But the one area where he went off. So if he's talking to a Phil Gerson or a Kristin Hansen or a Zach Elwood, we're sophisticated enough to sort out the good and the bad and so forth, and have a good dialogue with them. But he talks to young people, maybe men. So he goes through his speech, but then I happen to be Jewish, so he says, "I love Israel." But those guys in Congress, they lobby the House and Senate, and then he makes the statement, they're Marxist leaning. So all of a sudden, and the question is, well, what are the young people going to take? Jews or communists or whatever. So I'll finish up and say, uh, uh, we need to be able. I could go into a discussion with a conservative about Charlie Kirk, tell him what I like about what his style was, but also be knowledgeable where I think he's gone. So we need to get ourselves into the position that it can appreciate what a Charlie Kirk did, uh, and see if we could use that as a lessons learned. I'll leave it there.
Phil, if I may, I don't have a whole lot to add to your observations other than to reflect that, human beings are complex. Our relationships and interactions are complex. And all of us throughout our lives are building a toolkit of skills that help us have positive and productive interactions with one another. Free speech is an important and highly valued principle in US culture, and theoretically and ideally always will be. Um, our ability to exercise free speech and have a well articulated point of view is an important tool in our toolkit. And there are others. Critical thinking is an important tool that we want to raise and equip our young people to be able to use and apply. And civil discourse, the ability to treat each other with dignity, respect, appreciation, empathy, goodwill. These are also important values and tools that, at least in my view, are important ones that we want to be putting in as many of our toolkits as possible. So when I think about younger people, but really all people, it's a question of how we develop the holistic toolkit or tool set that helps us have these positive, productive relationships with others, from our spouse to our extended families, to our neighbors, to our coworkers, to our fellow countrymen. How do we apply the synthesis of free speech, critical thinking, and civil discourse that supports peaceful coexistence in the US? That's what I have to say. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
I would throw in there too. I just threw a link and it made me think, I think one of the things we need to do more of is less when we do debating or conversation is thinking more about not just about who we're talking to directly, but also like who's listening, like a persuasive depolarizing approach is, if I were debating Trump, for example, thinking less about the things I say about how he perceives my words. I'd be thinking more about how my words are perceived by people listening, right? So that made me think of I had written this piece about approaches, depolarizing approaches activists can take, and I think it applies to just having conversations, especially the online variety. Yeah.
I think another depolarizing approach, if you are talking to someone who is like acting very, very upset about what happened to Charlie Kirk, is to ask them questions about, what did you like about Charlie Kirk? What ideas did he have that you appreciated? What did he do in the world that you felt was really valuable? Then you could also, depending on how that goes, you could also ask, was there anything that gave you pause about what he did? Any areas where, he could have done things differently? And then you'll really have the sense of where they're coming from. And then there might be aspects of what they said that you could agree or disagree with. But if you started out just really showing that you have curiosity about where they're coming from and really took that in, then I think they're going to be much more inclined to return the favor and listen to what you have to say.
People really like to be heard. And in almost any interaction where you anticipate or feel a sense of anxiety that the person that you're about to interact with sees the world differently than you do, taking a moment just to coach yourself ahead of that interaction to agree with yourself that you are going to listen first. And Graham, I see you out there. Graham, one of the founders of the Listen First Coalition, which is an amalgam of more than 500 organizations across the country, all working on cultivating these bridging skills and norms. But to coach yourself to go into those interactions with a listen first perspective and a genuine openness to the possibility of learning something you didn't know before you went into it. It might trigger a sense of anxiety or even a sense of threat, but if you can coach yourself down off of that ledge, recognizing you're not standing on an actual physical ledge, that's just a physical reaction you're having. Take a couple of deep breaths, ask a couple of open-ended questions, and just enter in. And I know most of you do this. I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but it's like listening is a practice, like yoga is a practice or meditation is a practice. We never perfect it. We always have to work on it. And chances are it'll always hurt a little bit. But these are things that I do, that Zach does. We all have to do our practice. And these are some of the key skills, I think, that matter. The ability to just self-coach, to take a couple of deep breaths, to convert anxiety to curiosity, and just do our best to understand where people are coming from. And if possible, try to get down to that feeling level. Not what do they believe, not what do they think, not what facts do they hold dear, but how do they feel? How is something making them feel, and why do they feel that way? One of my mantras in this work boils down to I say trust before truth, feelings before facts. We can get to truth and facts with one another, but the best way to get there is by traveling through trust and feelings.
I like the phrase, this is Phil. I like the phrase, progress moves at the speed of trust.
Yeah,
That's great. Okay, let's move on to Terry, and then we will see what's going on in the chat. Hi, Terry.
Hello there. I'm Terry Stiegel. I'm in Northwest Indiana. It's not very rural around me, but I live in kind of like steel country here, where we have the steel mills. But just south of us is a lot of farms, and they're going to do some redistricting with our congressman to try and get him down in farm country there. It's heavily Republican, so we're really going to have to learn how to talk to those people south of us here. But you know what? I put a comment that was in a newspaper in the chat there, and I guess I get so angry, like yesterday when you got Mike Johnson, you know, the Speaker of the House, going on TV. The man that proclaims to be a man of the cloth, and he's an attorney and everything else, and he blatantly lies to the whole country about the shutdown. It's because of you know, he's worried about the undocumented people are going to get health care, which is a lie, straight out lie. And you know, so then we have to respond to that somehow. And the people that watch Fox News, they never get the truth, so they get poisoned by all this stuff. And then you try to have a conversation with them because all they do is get their stuff off Fox News, and it's like talking to a brick wall as far as getting through to them. And so how do we get past the poison of these people? I mean, it's like you know, I worked in the mill, and you know, had worked with one old guy, and he always said, you know, about management, he says, well, first liar wins. And that's almost like the Republican philosophy. You know, they put the lie out there, and then you have to spend all this time trying to clean up the mess, but you can't get to all the people because they're of the media that they're listening to.
Yeah, I would say, you know, I think it's important to realize for these things that this, you know, nobody, me or nobody else in depolarization space would say that there aren't very team-based and unreasonable things happening in politics, right? Like no one's making that claim. I think it's about how we respond to our opponents when we think we're doing that, right? So I think there's, you know, for example, if I was a Democratic politician, there are different ways I could respond to Mike Johnson or anyone. There's different paths to take, and I think there, in the same way, there's different paths for us to take when we talk to people we know about these things, right? There's more persuasive, less divisive, less angry approaches, or there's more, you know, you're an idiot if you believe these kinds of things, and driving the wedge deeper, right? Which only actually helps create the very thing that we're upset about, you know, on both sides. I would say I think both sides drive each other away and make each other, you know, more committed to non-compromising positions. So just to be clear, like, yeah, I would not say there, you know, the argument is not there's nothing bad happening or that you should not believe there's something bad happening. The argument is about how we approach things when we think something bad is happening, and that's what I work on, and that's what other people in the space work on. Yeah.
I want to just check in here because I believe does this end at the top of the hour?
If you all are able to stay on for another 10 minutes, we often run over.
Yeah. Okay. I can't speak for Zach, but I wanted to acknowledge, because even from my car and my phone, I'm doing my best to follow the chat thread. And there are really important and challenging questions in the chat that I want to acknowledge, and also just say we won't have time to do justice to all of them in detail with the time that remains on the call. But I want to be sure people know I see those questions, that Zach and I think here I can speak for Zach, that we'd both welcome follow-up correspondence or discussion on some of these hard questions. I think if there's one that I would maybe like to take on, and maybe I haven't seen every question in the chat either, but the perspective that somebody in the chat has shared about over-indexing on polarization when the problem might be something else, framed in the text as authoritarianism, and that we're, you know, distracting away from the quote unquote real problem focusing on working on polarization. And I wanted to offer up a few of my own quick thoughts on this, and also invite Zach to weigh in, because I know he thinks about this a lot too. And in fact, I'll quote Zach here, which is to say, we can work on polarization while we work on other things too. And there certainly are many people and organizations in the U.S. who see our current moment as posing an authoritarian risk and are working on that problem. Not everybody sees that we are in a moment of authoritarian risk, right? So while that may be a shared perspective among many Americans, it is not shared by all. So that's a fact or an issue we have to contend and grapple with. And it's one that leads me back to bridging time and time again, which is that when there are differences of opinion on anything, even something that may seem existential to some of us, and perhaps this pertains to other topics in the chat as well, when we hold those differences in perspective and worldview, we have to keep working on them. And based on everything I've seen, practiced, and supported, bridging is one of the most important tools we have to close gaps in our understanding and our worldview. And to state it a little more strongly, I often find myself thinking there is no other way. Whatever I perceive the risk, the threat, the gap to be, the only way out of that, the only way through is with bridging. Because if I feel that somebody holding and embracing a worldview that seems to threaten my sense of the future that I imagine and hold dear, we cannot get there by locking horns. I have to win them over. I have to win them over. I have to win them through trust building, relationship building, and a connection on a heart level towards seeing the world the way I see it. This is not easy, and I think Zach has already acknowledged more than once that we can employ the best blend of bridging practices and still come up against a wall in some circumstances. But I also want to suggest that sometimes the wall may not be as thick or rigid as we think it is, if we're willing to take the moment, step back, reframe, open our minds, take that deep breath, ask a couple of curious questions to get a little bit deeper into what is truly in the heart and on the mind of that person across from us. Perhaps sometimes they truly will be one who embraces the antithesis of what we believe, but in many cases it might be more nuanced than that. When we engage one-on-one, when we engage in person, when we take the time to decategorize people and learn what they individually truly deeply believe and why, it can in some instances, perhaps not all, but in some, reduce that sense of threat and move two people towards seeing the world in the future in a more similar way.
But we can't let the liars perpetuate the lies is the problem we're having. You know, and I run in this, I go to the retiree meetings at the Union Hall, and of course there we have our share of Trumpers. And you know, I got into a little debate over immigration things at one time, and also the last meeting I got into an argument about how could you support Trump, him being so anti-union, and you're sitting in the Union Hall. And the problem we have, like even in the steelworkers, 42% of the people voted for Trump in 2016. And I would virtually say at this time here, it's 55 to 60% voted for Trump. So we keep losing people because they keep spreading the poison, and we got to challenge the poison, I guess, is my point of view. And if we don't do that, if we don't challenge the lies, how do we overcome this? Because these people start believing. If you think about Trump, I mean, this guy has been a master at lies.
Well,
And he
Terry,
never says the truth.
Terry, I'm gonna just stop you there. I think you've brought up some really important things, and speakers have tried to address them with the time we have remaining. I would like to bring in some other folks who haven't had a chance to raise some questions. Karen, I still do see your hand up, and I do want to get to you. I want to check in with Anthony about whether There were some other questions in the chat that weren't sort of falling into that bucket that Kristin was trying to give a blanket answer to.
I do think there have been several questions in the chat that echo what Terry's saying. Basically, how do you sort out between what's kind of something that you work through, depolarization, interpersonal relationships, versus the stakes of massive lies and the consequences of those lies, everything from economic to attacks on immigrants, LGBTQ. I think that's a real issue. And anybody who talks about depolarization tends to face that from folks who say, yeah, that's all well and good, but there's real consequences here. Right. There's lives
from both sides. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's one thing. A second thing related to that is more from the liberal side. Edward had put some time ago in the chat that he works on this polarization as a rural person in rural Virginia, and yet most of what he gets from the Democratic Party and from the left in terms of messaging is itself highly polarizing. And so it's really hard to sort of take the resources from our own side and utilize them when they themselves seem to be highly polarizing. So sort of two separate questions.
Yeah. Look, I mean, just as there are a lot of people out there working on the perceived problem of authoritarianism, there are a lot of people and organizations working on the perceived damage of misinformation and disinformation. And it's good to work in those lanes. It's good that work is happening in those lanes. Once again, the thing that pulls me back time and time again to my commitment to bridging and helping elevate that toolkit in individuals, interpersonal interactions and institutions is when we think about information. The dynamic that we have to grapple with is that people's perception of truth is based largely on who and what they trust. So this goes back to my mantra that I said a minute ago, that the road to truth travels through trust. And that is something we have to contend with. And so when we want people to believe our truth, when we think we are the holders of truth, how do we build the trust that will enable them to be open to our truth, or what might even be the truth? So I'm just trying to complicate the understanding of what it takes to move a community or a society in the direction of embracing what is more true. We have to grapple with trust. And trust is built when relationships are built. So it's a very complex path. It's a more complicated path than simply saying, well, you're wrong, I'm right, here's the fact, let me point you to the source. But unfortunately, that second approach, challenging or pointing to what is the factual answer, we think it should work. It should work, right? The facts are here, the research is here, the data is here. It should work. It should be convincing. And yet it is not. And why is that? It brings us back to trust. And one more way to complicate the discussion around factual versus non-factual, information versus disinformation. Sometimes we are having direct battles or duels between two competing truths, but more often than not, what we contend with in civic life is different editorial agendas. And by that, I mean, it isn't that MSNBC and Fox are reporting the exact same story, but using different facts. No, they're just reporting totally different stories. One platform or channel is reporting on one set of stories and news. The other platform or channel is reporting on a different one. So again, it's not a debate over a set of facts pertaining to a single issue. It's two completely separate editorial agendas driving people's perceptions of what is happening and what matters in our country.
Thank you, Kristin. Karen, thank you for being patient. The last question will go to you, and then I invite everyone to stay on for a second, and we will tell you about our next month's briefing, which is going to be super exciting, and also some other events that we're having. Karen.
Yeah, thank you so much for the talk and for engaging with all of our questions. And I think my question sort of taps into some other thoughts that I've seen people sharing in the chat is I'm trying to think of the best way to sort of word this, but I guess when like I hear a lot of you talking about like bridging and like trying to be curious across, you know, perceived lines of difference. And I guess my question is like, what does that look like? Does it look different for people with more privilege versus people with less privilege, right? Like, I think about in our current political moment, right? Like, trans folks are under so much attack, immigrants are under so much attack, like, people of color are under so much attack. And so, like, how, like, does it look different for someone who is not an immigrant to try and engage in curiosity and bridging with someone who holds like very anti-immigrant views versus someone like who is an immigrant and who feels like those views are directly an attack on them? Like, I'm wondering if there's like,
Yeah.
if this sort of idea of bridging and curiosity is different based on the identities of the people and how they are going to feel affected by what they're hearing from another person.
I think we often dealt with this question at Builders Movement, the nonprofit I worked with, and I mean, my take is I don't think there is a difference. It's just a matter of what people are comfortable with. I mean, there's plenty of people, liberal, progressive people that will talk about the power of taking these approaches, you know, or including around race. Daryl Davis is a good example of somebody who, who spoke to racists. He's a black man who spoke directly to racists about their views. But I want to be clear. I'm not equating that to having all political discussions. I'm just saying I think the ideas are the same, and it's just a matter of what people are comfortable with. Like some people aren't comfortable having certain conversations, and it makes them scared or concerned. And I think that's true on both sides for any issue. So I think it's just a matter of I think the fundamental points of like what's persuasive remain, if that makes sense.
I'll just add that the issues of power, balance or imbalance of power, as well as safety, the perceived presence or lack of safety, are factors that would come into any calculation by any person about whether they feel that they are in a situation where they have the means and the wherewithal to bridge. And not every person in every situation will, nor would that be our recommendation. But I would suggest or challenge the notion, and I know you weren't saying it this way in your question, but the suggestion that bridging is the reserve of the privileged or can only be expected of the privileged. And of course, the privilege is kind of an ambiguous term as far as, how the calculus of how any of us either does or doesn't have privilege. I would just challenge every single one of us to consider whether we might be, in some instances, over-interpreting or over-indexing on a perceived lack of safety or a perceived lack of power that would inhibit us from having the courage to bridge, or being something that we lean on to say that we can't bridge because we're feeling a perceived sense of threat or a power imbalance or a lack of safety. Look, sometimes the threat to one's safety is real. I would never try to trivialize that away or say that it is never real in any situation. Other times, perhaps we are overblowing the sense of perceived threat or risk. And so just to ask ourselves the hard questions, are we truly in a situation where the calculus is against us to try to bridge? Or is this a case where I might be over-indexing on the risk or threat that would prevent me from extending my arm, my olive branch, in the direction of another?
I don't know if it's helpful, Eric, but I wanted to say, I think addressing a lot of these, I think a lot of these questions, not Karen's question but a lot of the questions are in general about skepticism about how we do this work, while also, fighting our opponents. And I think there are answers for all of those things. I think for one thing, I think anybody who is genuinely interested in reducing toxicity, which I think everyone should be, I think that's a logical thing I think anybody who genuinely wants that should be curious about how how the divides ramped up over the years, right? Like how did the contempt that both sides had for each other continually increase over the years, right? And if you start getting curious about that, like, so even if you think Trump's a fascist or doing very bad things, threatening democracy, I think it's very important that we take a step back and think about the big picture of how we got there, because these are not, whether it's Trump or, talking about America specifically, these are not things that are particular to America. These are just how groups grow polarized and contemptuous and fearful of each other. And if you start getting curious about how that played out in America, you're able to take a wider step back and see that a lot of the things that we're fighting over now are the outcome of these things that have been going on for many years, which Erica talks about in her book, and other, many progressive and liberal people have, written about, like Richard Rorty's book, Achieving Our Country, which was criticizing, many pessimistic liberal side things. And Rorty predicted someone like Trump taking power one day. And, you have various progressive liberal people who have written criticisms about, approaches on the liberal side. And again, this doesn't mean you have to think like both sides are the same. It's just getting curious about how did the perceptions on both sides get so out of whack and so skewed, and how do we get to where we are? And if you start getting curious about that, that's what I've seen from people who have, come around, who I've persuaded about my way of seeing things on the right and the left. They start looking at things from a more bird's eye view, as opposed to being like, oh, this Trump is very bad, or whoever's very bad. They're taking, very us versus them approaches, or very aggressive approaches. I think it's starting to see those things as more of an outcome of a polarization dynamic. And if you start seeing that, then I think you're more able to work towards your goals while keeping in mind, oh, what is bothering the other side? How have they formed their narratives that are so pessimistic about us? And I think often we're much too pessimistic. That's the definition of polarization. People are much too pessimistic about, by and large, what's driving the other side. And, we focus too much on the worst people on the other side, as opposed to, like, by and large, the mass of people that voted for XYZ leader, right? So I think it's getting curious about the dynamics and being willing to question our own pessimism about, like, what drives your average, person on the other side, and these kinds of things.
Great, thank you. Well, I think we're gonna have to call it a wrap. I want to thank Kristin and Zach so much for such an excellent discussion, and everyone who participated. And I want to bring Anthony on to tell us about next month.
Cool, thanks. Thank you very much, Kristin, and thanks a lot, Zach. Great discussion. Let me just say, for those who don't know, that RUBI is not agnostic about where we think the country's gone wrong and what we need to do differently. We are rural, progressive populists, and we think the rich and the powerful have run this country into the ground and have smashed and crushed farmers, small businesses, working people. We have a very clear perspective, and we don't just think that if we all sit around a campfire and hold hands that our problems will be solved. However, it's also quite clear to us that if we don't find a better way to depolarize our conversations, and particularly to just simply start to understand one another, we ain't going to get where we need to go. So we have a pretty clear idea of where we need to go, but we think that simply adding fuel to the various fires isn't getting us there. Okay, two quick things. Our November briefing will feature Barbara Kingsolver. I'm sure that many of you have heard of her. Barbara is a best-selling author. She's also a neighbor of my wife and mine in Southwestern Virginia. And Barbara is going to be discussing her latest book, the best-selling Demon Copperfield, and specifically talking about how the crisis, Copperhead, sorry, how it was modeled on Copperfield, Demon Copperhead, and how the opioid crisis and the crisis in rural Appalachia is kind of tied up in and part and parcel with our rural-urban divide. So that should be a great one. That's on the first Wednesday in November. You'll be hearing about it. And then I'll just also mention that next Wednesday at 7 p.m., we have a really important meeting for those who are interested in getting involved with our Beyond Resistance campaign. It's kind of a how-to get in many of the ideas we discussed today, but others as well. will be at that gathering, which is called Beyond Resistance, Planning Events, Getting Involved. So would love to have you there and be part of that Beyond Resistance campaign, which touches on some of what we discussed today.
Thanks, Anthony. Thanks to our speakers again, and look forward to seeing you all next month. Bye-bye.